Why are there so many different versions of Penance Brand, and which one's the best? Well, to answer the first question, very often when you're introduced to a build, it's through the skill and the ascendancy. Let's just say Tornado Shot Deadeye. You already know what skill they're using and you're already aware of the ascendancy. They're using the Tornado Shot bow skill on the Ranger Deadeye ascendancy. However, what if I called it a crystallized omniscience projectile scaling build? That's a little bit weirder, right? And with good reason. But if you really think about it, there's not that much difference between a crystallized omniscience Tornado Shot Deadeye and a crystallized omniscience Venom Gyre Deadeye, or even a crystallized omniscience Lightning Strike Champion. We've jumped skills, jumped build archetypes, or have we? Because we're all within the crystallized omniscience archetype there, even if the skill is almost the opposite of what you had before. And overall, the description is vaguely recognizable at best. Another reason we're seeing so many builds with Penance Brand of Dissipation in particular is it's incredibly overtuned, and that's kind of carrying builds, even if the archetype might not be viable in future leagues. Though I guess to find out if it sticks around or not, you're going to have to get subscribed and leave a like while you're down there. But because it has this high level of damage, and because it scales extremely well with Fizz's extra gem levels or charges, it leads to a wide variety of builds, many of which aren't similar. They share the same main skill name, and that's really about it. For example, Righteous Fire of Arcane Devotion is a mana build that actually shares more in common with some of the mana stacking variants of Penance Brand than the mana stacking variants of Penance Brand do with the charge stackers. And the gem scaling works very similarly to a lot of other Fizz spells like Wave of Conviction. But it's not that far off of an Arc of Surging build, if I'm being completely honest with you. And last up, Poison Pathfinder, well, if you look at Poison Pathfinder MF with bows, again, it's not that different. Though in the case of Penance Brand, you might want an original sin, whereas bow MF probably doesn't need it. Therefore, you get Penance Brand of Dissipation on Inquisitor, Hierophant, Occultist, Trickster, Pathfinder, Slayer, and a few more niche ascendancies. And so I'm going to dive into each of these a little bit, go over some of the core mechanics or items they're leveraging, and talk about why someone might play them. Starting with Penance Brand Inquisitor, which is very common in SSF due to easy gearing and lots of damage. However, on Inquisitor, the defenses take a lot more work, as opposed to some of the other ascendancies on this list. On softcore trade, a lot of the high-end Penance Brand Inquisitor setups go for the ultimate endgame of Energy Blade. This is an extremely versatile framework, which I covered for my Cast on Crit Energy Blade build last league, built around Ivory Tower, Coruscating Elixir, Shaper's Touch, and Wrathpith Globe. The idea is you stack life and then reserve it to stack Energy Shield, and then cut that in half to get a ton of damage via Energy Blade, which you then apply via Battle Mage and Spellblade. Wrathpith also takes care of both your increased damage and your crit. So it's really a great way to scale damage all round. Penance Brand just happens to be a good delivery vehicle here. On the other hand, a lot of Penance Brand Pathfinders are just Poison MF Pathfinders, like I mentioned near the start. This leads to the lowest damage ceiling due to the dot cap, but that doesn't mean it's not more than enough damage to completely evaporate Uber bosses, and having capped damage gives you more investment in the focus of defenses. The other advantage here is there are no core items, though if you want to keep scaling, on a high-end build I would very much recommend Original Sin to get around the awkwardness of Spell Elemental Poison. Maybe more interestingly on Pathfinder, there's some extremely tanky nebulous hit versions, but for more information on that, stay tuned, because it felt like I needed to do a dedicated video exploring that build's defensive framework and its rather intricate mechanics. Hierophant, on the other hand, is, well, a massive mix. A few are Inquisitors in disguise. Some are charged stacker glass cannons clearly intended for Sanctum running. And then you have the mana builds. Out of these, the mana builds thrive almost exclusively on Hierophant. So let's look into those a little bit more. The name of the game here is spending a lot of mana for Indigon, which results in a massive ramping spell damage bonus. And the most common way I see people doing this is a Cast on Crit Archmage setup, where you rapidly recast Penance Brand to ramp the mana costs and therefore the damage. This one's definitely very interesting, but it's also the sort of thing that I wouldn't really advise to most people. Now I have to say, personally, I wouldn't really play a Hierophant. It's certainly cool if you want to do mana stacking stuff, but if you don't want to be a hipster, then I feel like all of the other options that I've talked about before, and some of the options I'm going to talk about afterwards, are just a little bit more well-rounded and don't have that weird awkwardness around the ramp-up. The exception here being if you want to make a ZHP Sanctum runner for no-hit runs, in which case absolutely look into some of the Glass Cannon Hierophants because, well, they're purpose-built for that and they do it very well, though there are Glass Cannons on several other archetypes which do work in addition, such as Occultist and Slayer. This is where most of the charge stacking variants are focused. You want a Relic Heshes, Malachai's Loop, Void Battery, and of course, Badge of a Brotherhood. That way, you scale maximum power charges to get increased damage, crit chance, crit multi, more increased damage, a little extra increased damage, also a ton of cast speed, which is great for Penance Brand, and if you're on the Slayer version, even some phys reduction and resistances via endurance charges. The Occultist version tends to be a little bit squishier without investment, but deal higher damage. They convert most of their damage to cold though, so you can freeze a lot of enemies, making them a non-issue. Whereas the Slayer version is a lot more well-rounded, and if you cap your spell suppression, makes for a great uber boss killer. For more on that, well, I have a video that I'll link up in the card and down below. But I'd say regardless, make sure you have some phys taken as if you're an Occultist and some spell suppression if you're a Slayer, otherwise you're going to be a 6 portal Andy. Don't worry, damage is basically free. And then last but certainly not least, we have Trickster. Now here's the difference between Trickster and everything I've talked about thus far. Most of the ascendancies I've mentioned are offensive, they give you damage. But Penance Brand of Dissipation almost already has infinite damage. And Trickster gives you insanely powerful defenses. So, many Tricksters are either scaling charges or gem level, and they're using things like Replica Dragon Fangs if you're going with the gem level, and the regular setup for charges. But because they're a defensive ascendancy, and because they have access to ES Overleech, the gameplay is going to feel a lot better, especially on a low budget, than many of the other builds covered so far. Sure, you won't kill things instantly, but when you don't kill it instantly, it won't instantly kill you. You'll be able to survive those hits, heal up, and continue doing damage. Unfortunately, the damage is a little more difficult to scale on low investment. So do keep that in mind if you want fast-paced gameplay. But okay, at this point you must be wondering, is this just an excuse for Ten to ramble on about awesome and cool synergies in Path of Exile? No, definitely not. I would never make a YouTube video about that. I definitely don't have a series called The Meta Report, which is basically just that. But I did promise at the beginning that I'd answer the question of which is best. And the problem with answering that is, it depends. For example, best for what? If you say mapping, well, odds are any of them will work pretty darn well. So what about mapping in SSF? Then I'd lean towards either Trickster or Inquisitor. If you want to do uber bosses, then I think a well-rounded Slayer or Occultist charge stacker is definitely the best option, but others can get there, and if you want to know more about the charge stacker Slayer, again, check out my recent build. But what about if you want to MF? Then you're probably going Pathfinder. And the super tanky version of Pathfinder is also good for either tier 17 maps or deep delve, but it's built very differently from the Magic Find version. And so that leaves poor Hierophant as the odd one out, because unfortunately, poor Hierophant is doing way too many things, and a lot of the builds don't do anything that is meaningfully different than any of the other ascendancies. Where yes, you can have roughly the same damage and defenses as an Inquisitor, but now you're a Hierophant gaining different bonuses. In particular, having the extra brand frequency, while most of the duration is expired, does definitely help with the ramping damage effect, to get the most out of your brand. But that isn't to say that you can't get a very similar effect by playing a Slayer or a Trickster and having the proper brand duration and cast speed. But again, if meta builds really appeal to you and you don't mind a damage ramp up, I could absolutely see a Hierophant working, or of course, if you want a ZHP Sanctum runner. In short, at least while the skill's this overtuned, there really isn't a completely incorrect answer. But if I was personally asked, okay, Ten, I want you to pick my Penance Brand build, what would you pick? Number 1, charge stacking Slayer. For most uses, this is going to be the best mix of a build that feels good to play, is tanky, and has great damage. The next best would be a Trickster, probably with gem level scaling and fizz as extra, because on a budget I just think it performs the best out of every option there, as long as you don't want to be a Glass Cannon 6 portal Andy. And in general, I'd warn people away from the Pathfinders. But now I'm curious, do you look at builds as skill plus ascendancy, or do you look at builds as item synergies plus potential applications? And if you do look at them as skill and ascendancy, has this video changed your mind at all? Also, if you've been playing Penance Brand, which version have you played so far, and what do you think of it? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. And if you're looking for something else to watch, check out my Penance Brand of Dissipation Slayer, or a little bit more info on how the charge stacking archetype works. Links to both of those will be up in the card and down below. With that said, I'd like to take a moment to thank my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. But that's all for me today. Thank you for watching to the end. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.